All right, and I'll get us kicked off. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here today. To open today's briefing, I have the pleasure of introducing WEACT's co-founder and executive director, Peggy Shepard. Peggy also currently serves as the co-chair of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. We're very excited to have Peggy introduce the history of WEACT, as well as the principles of environmental justice in which our work is grounded. And with that, Peggy, I'll pass it over to you.
Well, good morning, everyone. Again, I'm Peggy Shepard. I co-founded WEACT for Environmental Justice back in 1988 to address environmental racism that was rampant in my West Harlem neighborhood. But since then, we have evolved to address these issues with our colleagues regionally, nationally, and globally. Now, our mission is to build healthy communities by ensuring that people of color and low-income residents participate meaningfully and effectively in the creation of sound and fair environmental health and protection policies. We accomplish this through advocacy, research, education, and training. Now, to ensure the perspective of grassroots communities infuses federal policy, 12 years ago, we established an office in Washington, D.C. to advance the federal policy needs and interests of our Northern Manhattan community and of the Environmental Justice Leadership Forum, which is a national coalition of 54 environmental justice organizations across 22 states, all working together to advance environmental and climate justice by impacting policy so we can ensure the protection and promotion of communities of color and low-income communities in federal policy throughout the country. Now, before diving into our policy priorities, we want to take some time to make sure that each of you are familiar with the principles of environmental justice that really ground the environmental justice movement and the work that we do at WEACT. And you will see them outlined on this presentation. Now, as research has demonstrated, race is the primary predictor of where polluting facilities are sited. Likewise, communities of color and low-income communities face the greatest disproportionate risk and harmful impacts across health and other criteria due to a legacy of discriminatory infrastructure policies and disinvestment. Now, the 17 principles of environmental justice, which were adopted at the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit back in 1991, I attended there as a delegate. These are foundational guides, these principles, for our policy agenda as we work to address the pervasive toxic challenges confronting underserved frontline communities. Now, the 17 principles center respect for Mother Earth, as well as each other, as we strive to improve our shared environment and set the foundation for policy that is transformative, that counters past harms, and mitigates climate change. Now, for example, our commitment to protecting NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, and ensuring communities have the right to review projects permitted in their neighborhoods, that is based on Principle 7, which demands the right to participate as equal partners at every level of decision-making. Now, similarly, our work to strengthen multi-pollutant standards is based on Principle 6, which demands the cessation of the production of all toxins and hazardous waste. Now, this February, we approached the 30th anniversary of Executive Order 12898, which is titled Federal Actions to Address Environmental Justice in Minority Populations and Low-Income Populations. Through that executive order, we are finally seeing the administration take bold actions in support of environmental and climate justice, such as the Justice 40 Initiative and historic funding and investment going to underserved communities. There's a lot more to do, and I'm looking forward to getting this work done together. So we hope that you will spend time with these principles, keep them on top of mind as we build on the successes and share our policy agenda priorities. We've had significant accomplishments in New York and across the country. Our colleagues are proud to build on this progress and will continue to stay true to our mission and those most impacted. So we hope you will continue to join us, and we welcome you to our movement. There's so much we can achieve together, which is necessary. So I want to thank you all for joining us today and would like to turn it over to Dana Johnson, our Senior Director of Strategy and Federal Policy, and she will set the stage for our environmental justice policy priorities for the remainder of the 118th Congress. So thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you so much for that introduction and grounding us, Peggy, in the history and mission of WE ACT, as well as the EJ Forum. So, as Peggy noted, we're in our 35th year as an organization that's really working to build healthy communities across the country and to ensure that people who live in a community of color or area of low income are able to participate in a meaningful way in the decision making that is happening across a variety of focus areas, which we'll get into today, and you'll see reflected in our policy agenda. We have in the last couple of sessions of Congress, but certainly over our 12 years of being here in Washington, D.C., been able to really be in partnership with many of your offices, with your bosses on, how best to address the environmental justice issues that, impact our communities. And I think that we have done some particularly powerful work in partnership with you all around the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act. We're still talking about and working to implement the parts of the American Rescue Plan, and that work has been really great. We were really proud and pleased to see environmental justice represented in federal bills. And we believe that that is just the floor, right? It's the foundation with which we get to build on with you. And so in our policy agenda, you'll see the importance of continuing to ensure that people's voices are being added to conversations around how do we bring the Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law into fruition. What are some of those things that, from a legislative perspective, we can be in partnership with you on to ensure that our communities are clean and healthy and vibrant? And in order to do that work, we wanted to first introduce you to our team. We've been really fortunate to expand our team to align with the expertise that we believe is needed, that's necessary to build out some of these key policy areas. So you'll get to meet a team made up of government affairs practitioners, research experts, policy authority across the energy spectrum, across health and environmental health and toxins. You'll see a focus on beauty justice. You'll see us look at the permitting process as a whole, as well as permitting when it relates to really transitioning our energy economy. How do we ensure that communities have a voice and we protect what we believe is a democratic process, while also ensuring that we evolve our energy economy in a way that improves the lives of people from an affordability, so an economic perspective, as well as a public health perspective. You'll also see us talk about the importance of preserving the rights of all Americans to participate in the democratic process. We can't have environmental justice, we can't have a clean, healthy planet and people if we have a disempowered electorate. And so my colleagues will be will be sharing with you about the importance of voter rights legislation that, has been introduced in the last couple of sessions of Congress. And we'll be looking for opportunities to be able to move those things forward with you, with your offices, and with your bosses. So I am going to end there. I really look forward to the questions that you might have for us about the environmental justice landscape generally and our policy agenda specifically. And I am going to turn it over to my colleague Astrid Dubois, who serves as our Government Affairs Manager here in the Federal Policy Office.
Thanks, Dana. Hello, everyone. Nice to see folks. I want to jump into one of our policy priorities. And as you know, and you'll see in our policy agenda, we work in a lot of different areas, but wanted to take time to spotlight some of, the issues that really feel top of mind. So as Dana mentioned, and as you know, last session, we passed, historic climate and infrastructure legislation. And the task at hand now is really ensuring that those funds reach communities that have been disproportionately burdened by the negative impacts of climate change and systematically left out of consideration for federal spending. And this is also, a directive from the Biden administration with the Justice 40 initiative. One major project that WEACT has undertaken is a national campaign called Justice Forward. And this is a community-led effort to ensure transparency and collaboration between elected officials, municipalities, and those who live in disadvantaged communities that the Justice 40 initiative was designed to support. Through this campaign, our team had the privilege of getting to visit communities and partner with them to host briefings and tours on the ground in Texas, New York, Alaska, Michigan, Georgia, Massachusetts, Washington, Kansas City, and Illinois. And, through these tours and conversations, something that really stood out and, that anyone who has worked with communities will not at all be surprised to know is that, grassroots leaders, folks that live in communities, have solutions and they know best what their communities need. To that end, I really wanted to take the opportunity to uplift the EPA's climate or environmental and climate justice community change grants. Folks might remember these as, it's the 2 billion EJ grants that we advocated really hard to get included in the Inflation Reduction Act when it was passed. So this funding is now open for applications. So really want to take the opportunity to highlight that, this is a very historic federal funding opportunity that can go directly to community groups and leverage, their expertise to uplift and hopefully, realize this transformational change to fund the solutions that they've been advocating for on the ground. So I bring it up today because I really want to encourage each office to, especially on the district side, know about these, be connected with the EJ and local groups in your community, and serve as a support to ensure that this historic opportunity is getting taken advantage of. So they are operating on rolling applications, and the current funding deadline is November 21st of this year. And like I said, it's a 2 billion pot of funding. So really, really hoping that we'll see a lot of, these really important changes come through with programs like this. So in addition, we also just hope that your offices and especially your district offices will serve as a support for community grassroots environmental justice organizations. And another role and resource for you all to know about is the EPA's TICTAC hubs. And WEACT has the honor of serving as the TICTAC hub for Region 2. And that's an opportunity to connect groups to these set up technical assistance hubs specifically for environmental justice to ensure that they have the support and expertise to better access these federal funds. So really want to ensure that this is top of mind for all of you to really have real change on the ground in the communities that you work on. So with that, I would be excited to turn it over to my colleague, AJ, to further discuss some of our priorities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Astrid. And to introduce myself, my name is AJ Yuan. I am the legislative coordinator here at WEACT, and I use he, him pronouns. I'll be speaking about the A. Don McEachin Environmental Justice for All Act, and I first want to acknowledge that I know that a lot of your offices are either leading the bill and have also co-sponsored, so definitely want to express our gratitude to you all for your leadership on this piece of legislation. To give some background, the EJ for All Act was first introduced by Representative Raul Grijalva and the late great Representative A. Don McEachin. The bill was developed in extensive consultation with communities through listening sessions and public commenting periods, which WEACT helped support. We feel that this bill was truly made for frontline communities by frontline communities, and as such, it has been a major priority for WEACT to advance this bill ever since it was first introduced. This bill includes a number of policies that would strengthen protections for EJ communities. Firstly, it would amend the Civil Rights Act to prohibit discrimination based on disparate impact. It would also require the consideration of cumulative impacts in permitting decisions under the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, as well as the National Environmental Policy Act, also known as NEPA. And to touch briefly on what cumulative impacts are, cumulative impacts consider all the pollution sources in a given area and how they're affecting not just the air, water, and soil, but also human health as well. And by adding cumulative impacts considerations to permitting decisions, it'll really greatly expand the scope of how environmental impacts are being considered. There's a number of other policies, including the Act, but in all, this bill will codify and strengthen a number of protections for the environmental justice communities. We highly encourage your offices to review the Act, co-sponsor, and also encourage co-sponsorship with your colleagues as well as within your caucuses. With that, I will pass it along to my colleague, Yua.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. Today, I'm going to speak to you about multi-pollutant standards. So to begin, leading the clean air for the long haul is a national cohort of EJ groups working together to move forward campaigns centering overburdened communities in a federal rulemaking in the power and transportation sectors. And this is to realize emissions reduction and health improvements in our communities. So to go over some priority rules, we know there can be a lot of regulations to track. So we want to take the time to share updates on some of our priority regulations. So first, we're going to talk about the National Ambient Air Quality Standards for particulate matter. And this is also known as PM, NAAQS, or SIT rule. So the EPA proposes to revise the primary health-based annual PM2.5 standard from its current level of 12 micrograms per cubic meter to within the range of 9.0 to 10.0, and no change to the daily 24-hour standard, which is currently at 35. The proposed PM, or let's just call them the SIT rules, standard leaves communities of color behind unless the strongest option, an annual standard of 8 micrograms per cubic meter, as well as a 24-hour daily standard no higher than 25, is finalized and implemented. We are expecting the standard to be released in the near future. So moving on to the National Ambient Air Quality Standards for ozone. Like particulate matter, exposure to smog causing ozone is linked to asthma and other chronic respiratory illnesses. And so we were disappointed by EPA's decision to delay updating and tightening the ozone NAAQS rules. We will continue to call on EPA to reconsider this move and tighten the national limit on ozone to reflect the latest science of 55 to 66 parts per billion to protect public health and safeguard environmental justice communities. So we're going to continue to move along to mercury and air toxic standards. Coal and oil-fired power plants are the largest sources of mercury and air toxics, such as benzene, dioxins, and heavy metals, which are linked to development issues in babies and children, cardiovascular disease, and cancer, to name a few. It is imperative that the EPA quickly finalize the strongest mercury and air toxic standards for electric generating units, especially as low-income Indigenous people of color who are often positioned and living in close proximity to these plants are particularly vulnerable to the adverse impacts. And still more, greenhouse gas standards and guidelines for fossil fuel power plants. And so we want to share these updates about EPA's recent proposed rules on the greenhouse gas standards and guidelines for fossil fuel fired power plants. But unfortunately, the proposed rule puts unwarranted faith in carbon capture and storage, better known as CCS, technologies. Though it has no demonstrated basis to be considered the best system of emissions reduction. The proposed rule also fails to address the considerable cumulative impacts and burdens that CCS, as well as low GHG or greenhouse gases, hydrogen co-firing, will further impose on environmental justice communities. These ranges from exposure to health-harming co-pollutants like nitrogen oxides and particulate matter, and extensive build-out of carbon dioxide, pipelines, and other infrastructure that result in displacement, loss of homes, businesses, and social and cultural centers to exposure to public health hazards and safety risks from leaks, explosions, and other harmful impacts. So we hope your offices listen to the concerns of EJ communities and communicate these nuances to leadership. So now we're going to move on to cars. Oh, I saw the screen. You can go back one. Thank you. Cars and light-duty trucks not only represent 94% of the nation's on-road vehicles, but they make up the greatest proportion of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions of all transportation sources. The EPA must swiftly enact the strongest long-term standards that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and tailpipe air pollution to send the appropriate signal to industry to hasten the transition to cleaner, zero-emission electric vehicles, and to safeguard the health and safety of environmental justice communities unduly burdened by pollution from light and medium duty vehicles. Now, greenhouse gas emission standards for heavy duty vehicles, and this is the phase 3. Similarly, even though heavy duty vehicles make up 4% of vehicles on the road, they contribute more than 25% of greenhouse gases within the transportation sector. Moreover, the heavy duty truck sector is an egregious form of environmental injustice. It is a major source of harmful and deadly air pollutants, such as soot and smog forming particulate matter and nitrogen oxide. So what we are calling for is the EPA must finalize strong standards that limit greenhouse gas emissions and toxic air pollution from the heavy duty vehicle sector to send a clear signal to manufacturers for zero emission electric vehicles, and ultimately ensure clean air and protect the health of overburdened environmental justice communities as soon as possible. So we encourage your offices to track these important regulations and always consider the impacts to environmental justice communities. As standards are released, please ensure environmental justice concerns are uplifted and provided support via letters, statements, member letter conversations to ensure that the Biden-Harris administration enacts the strongest possible air quality standards. In addition, we know that good regulations are regularly coming under attack with the Congressional Review Act. Please stay vigilant against these attacks and side with environmental justice communities to protect critical regulations and educate other offices on the importance of these EPA regulations. So I'll pass it on to my colleague, Jasmine James.
Great, thanks so much. You Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Jasmine Jennings, and I am an attorney with We Act for Environmental Justice. Today, I have the privilege of speaking with you all briefly about NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. And as Peggy, our executive director and co-founder, reflected, NEPA is the people's environmental law. We Act has a long-standing history of protecting, preserving, and oftentimes in this recent climate, shielding NEPA from carve-outs and challenges that serve to weaken the statute. So I'm happy to briefly share some of the work that we have done within this past year, but noting that our advocacy for NEPA spans back to the founding of the Federal Policy Office and often before that. This past spring and early summer during the debt ceiling negotiations, as I'm sure many folks will remember, provisions of NEPA were a bargaining chip as we faced that integral moment. And We Act served as a convener for environmental justice communities across the country seeking to take action in that moment. We swiftly rose to the moment by creating a public comment letter, a letter rather that we drafted in response to some of the rhetoric and proposals that were swirling in the Hill. That letter had the support of over 50 plus organizations, environmental justice and allied partners, all calling for the protection of NEPA and certainly ensuring that those key provisions, public participation, community engagement, regulatory oversight, and thorough and wholesome reviews of environmental impacts for major projects were not taken from the rule. Now, unfortunately, there was some challenges and ultimately carve-outs that NEPA suffered as a result of this debt ceiling negotiations, and We Act remained a steadfast supporter and shielder of the rule going into August of 2023, where we participated in the phase 2 proposed rulemaking. The Biden-Harris administration initially proposed a two-part restoration of NEPA, if you will, and the phase 2 rulemaking, which we participated in this past summer, was also another moment for We Act to support NEPA in partnership with environmental justice communities across the country. We partnered closely with Green Latinos and circulated a letter that was also supported by many of the offices on this call, and we are very grateful for your support in that effort, where essentially we celebrated the Council of Environmental Quality's proposals to center and refocus NEPA on environmental justice and climate justice considerations. Now, that rulemaking has not been finalized. We are anxiously awaiting a final rule. And our ask for you is that as we await this final rule, and certainly when it's available, you all continue to support NEPA at its heart for what it is, the people's environmental law, and a way for folks to intervene, engage, learn more about projects, and certainly make sure that their communities and their families are protected. Next slide, please. I also have the privilege today of speaking with you all about the clean energy transition, and We Act's values are very clearly rooted in this work because it is about bringing folks along as we transition to a renewable, sustainable future. That work includes and is largely centered around the building of transmission. As we have spoke about earlier, transmission and in general, the idea that renewable energy is key to moving forward and meeting our climate goals is very near and dear to We Act's heart, with a focus on building a foundation, a regulatory foundation that centers communities that will be housing the transmission and other sorts of clean energy deployment opportunities. To support this work, we have done a number of things, again, supported by many of the offices here on this webinar. So again, we thank you for that. Some of that work includes our development in partnership with other environmental organizations of the transmission principles, which outline a equitable and just way to move forward with building out transmission. And equity and justice in this context means particularly partnership nurturing relationships between transmission project developers and communities housing the transmission, nurturing that relationship over the lifespan of the transmission line, which can span 20, 30 plus years, and also ensuring that communities are a part of the conversation first and early. So WEACT uses the term first, early, and ongoing engagement, meaning that at the beginning, as a precursor to the project, and certainly throughout the life cycle of the project, making sure that there is communication, opportunities for engagement, and public participation. We also advocate for these values before the regulatory agencies charged with authority over transmission. So that includes FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, as well as the Department of Energy, DOE, and others. And we anticipate and welcome your support as we embark on this clean energy transition as an advocacy community. Thank you.
Thank you, Jasmine. I have the honor to speak with you today about WEACT's work to advance healthy housing, energy efficiency, and clean air policies and practices. We do this by continuing to leverage the results from our Out of Gas, In with Justice study, the first pilot study of its kind that looked at the air quality impacts of a gas to induction transition in affordable housing with tenants in place. We also advocate for healthy indoor air environments through indoor air quality standards and continuing to support the use of funding from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, funding to build healthy, decarbonized communities across the nation. WEACT is working to improve the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, known as LIHEAP, by advocating for increased funding from the federal government to subsidize expensive summer utility bills for qualified households. Cool homes with access to air conditioning are the best emergency defense against heat-related illness and death. Yet low-income households and households of color struggle to access and afford the energy required to outfit their homes for extreme temperatures. You may have heard of the Heating and Cooling Relief Act, which was reintroduced in the 118th Congress by Congressman Bowman and Senator Markey. And this would invest in and expand the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program to universalize energy assistance for all of those who need it. Currently, it is estimated that only 16% of households eligible for LIHEAP are actually served. So we ask that you co-sponsor this important bill and also encourage your colleagues and caucuses to do so as well. Lastly, as ongoing appropriations continue, we ask that you defend funding for key programs, including DOE's energy conservation standards and EPA's Energy Star. Thank you all, and next I will pass it over to my colleague Manny.
Thanks, Annika. Yeah, my name is Manny Salgado, and I serve as Federal Research Manager for WEACT here in our Federal Policy Office. And a lot of the research that we do here involves analyzing how fall solutions and oil and gas policy affects the lives of communities of color and frontline communities throughout the United States. Lately, we've been focused a lot on fall solutions such as hydrogen and CCS, as well as fighting the LNG build-out. We've come to think of those three separate but very interlinked areas as a triangle, with each one of these areas forming a point of the triangle, and then the communities that are facing that are overburdened by the fossil fuel industry lying within the middle and in danger from each one of these separate policy areas. We've continued to engage on rulemakings within the EPA, such as the Clean Air Act Part 111 rules, which have put forward hydrogen co-firing and CCS as possible ways for power plants to mitigate their carbon footprints. We continue to believe that those are false solutions. CCS has not been proven to be successful at the levels that the EPA has put forward, and hydrogen has plenty of pollution aspects of its own, including NOx emissions, as well as continuing all the pollution from the fossil fuel industry. In addition to that, we've remained engaged on the hydrogen tax credit, which we just recently received guidance on from the Treasury, 45V, and the recently announced hydrogen hubs. More recently, over the past 48 hours, we've seen a lot of movement on the LNG front, and we remain very engaged and listening to see what's coming forward on that front. And while we are very happy to hear that there's a possibility of a pause coming due to the climate change implications of LNG export facilities, we do want to center that in addition to those climate change impacts, each one of those facilities has a large impact on EJ communities. And we'd like to remind our members of Congress that keeping those communities' concerns and making sure that they are addressed is really an important aspect to consider when we think about LNG. So our congressional ask is essentially to support stringent rules that do not place EJ communities in danger from false solutions and require that there's a comprehensive analysis of the cumulative impacts of these different policies on frontline communities. That's a really broad way of saying that we really want you to take the public health aspects of frontline communities and fossil fuels into account. Specifically, what we mean by that is supporting strong regulations for electrolytic hydrogen in the form of the 3 pillars. We Act, in combination with other members of the Climate Action Campaign, has put forward a set of hydrogen principles, which states that we do not advocate for any fossil fuel-based hydrogen products. That includes blue and gray hydrogen. In addition to that, the recent Treasury guidance does include the 3 pillars. We would really hate to see any backsliding on that and removal or carve-outs from those rules. We feel that if there is to be a future where hydrogen can be used safely and cleanly in a limited way, those pillars have to remain intact and be a big portion of the guidance moving forward. On the hubs, we remain engaged, and we're asking for our congressional allies to support transparency from the Department of Energy on information regarding the locations of those hubs and what type of infrastructure is being built out within them. To date, we haven't received much from the DOE, except assurances that community benefits agreements will be made and will be taken into consideration. But frontline communities really need to understand what type of infrastructure is being placed within their communities and what the impacts to public health what that means for the public health of those communities. And as I said, going forward with LNG export terminals, we're have our ears to the ground, and we're waiting to see what the administration announces. But we would hope that congressional allies would support the centering of EJ concerns and EJ public health when it comes to those facilities, and to broadly, support a reframing of these export facilities, which have never been denied in the past, and to start considering that a continuation of fossil fuel industry has huge impacts for EJ communities throughout the country. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our National Organizing Manager, Rachel Baker, and I'll pass it off to her.
Hey y'all, my name is Rachel. Thanks so much for that, Manny, and thanks everybody for joining us today. Like I said, my name is Rachel. I am the National Organizing Manager here at We Act. And my role is to connect with EJ organizations across the country who are doing the work on the ground to fight for clean air, clean water, and equitable decision-making power in the government. I would like to take this moment to ground us in the stakes of environmental justice. Just yesterday, I spoke with Marquita Bradshaw, who has lived in Memphis, Tennessee her entire life. She has watched her community pass away prematurely due to the lack of clean air in her community. She lives on the front line of polluting facilities that have made their water and air toxic to consume. She has fought every day for the past 3 decades to save lives in her community. And the thing is that her story is not unique. We speak with folks all across the country, your constituents, who are fighting for the same basic rights that all Americans are entitled to. This year at We Act, we are continuing to build capacity of our environmental justice groups to amplify their voices on the local and federal level, as well as educating legislators on the needs of their communities. So this year, we're going to host in-person networking convenings. We're going to host workshops and more to make sure that our coalition is ready to speak with their representatives and effectively influence legislation. So with that, I would love to ask you all to encourage your bosses in your offices to engage with community organizations in your districts on environmental policy decisions, and seek feedback and review first, early, and ongoing. You know, as we've mentioned before in this call, our communities know what we need the best. So it's best to have them in the process as early as possible. And like I mentioned, this is a matter of life and death. It's a matter of avoiding asthma in children and saving people from cancer. There is power to save lives in this room right now. And with that, thank you so much, and I'll pass it to AJ.
Hey, thank you so much, Rachel. And I just want to say thank you again to all of our amazing staff members for presenting today. We would like to now open up a Q&A period to answer all of your questions directly. Please feel free to continue submitting any questions that you all may have through the Q&A box. And it looks like we have a few already, so I'll kick us off. Our first question is, how much power, if any, will EJ4All have in preventing legal action, such as the recent decision from a federal court in Louisiana that prevents the EPA/DOJ from enforcing Title VI of the Civil Rights Act against that state's agencies? And as a follow-up, what policy avenues may be best suited to try and address these kinds of challenges? And I'll pass it to our director, Dana, to take a first stab at the question.
Yeah, thank you, Christopher, for that question. I think it would be, an understatement to say that we are in a tough environment, and seeing this kind of lower court decision come to fruition and not having, recourse even at within the Supreme Court on how to address this in the wake of the affirmative action case, really puts us in a tough place. I know that we are a part of a network of advocates that are focused on Title VI and how we can preserve it and use it in responding to environmental injustices. And there are some things that we have been asking the Department of Justice for that I can lift up here. In the absence of being able to fight it, we do believe that the EPA is empowered to, enforce and monitor compliance at the local level, at the state level. And so I think our, ensuring that there are strong multi-pollutant standards related to pollution, as one example, and being sure that the EPA enforces that and uses its authority is critically important. I think one of the additional ways that your offices can contribute to ensuring that we are able to address pollution in communities is to address some of the deficiencies that we see, and that's deficiencies related to staff, just having enough people to be able to stay on top of compliance and oversight. And so when we think about the appropriations process and ensuring that agencies have enough money for staffing, for systems and process changes, I think we can look to you and your offices for, support in that regard. And I think the, final sort of short-term solution while we, really work to address the environmental racism part of the work that we do is, and the role of Title VI in that is, we may have to look to the states, and we may have to look to, your congressional offices as vehicles to help convene, stakeholders. And one of the ways that we can start to look at the states is through a set of model bills that we developed called Dismantling Injustice. They are 5 bills that look at, indirect source permits related to pollution, how we renew permits for new facilities, how we document pollution, cumulative impact of pollution from multiple sources, so that we, have a record and are able to track that. How we look at pollution from the transportation sector. So we'll drop a link to that model build portal in the chat, and perhaps there is something that we could, be in conversation with you all around from a federal perspective that can be beneficial to communities on the ground, in the absence of being able to use Title VI. But I think we are equally concerned about, that preserving that that tenant and working with offices to figure out how we can do that.
Great. Thank you so much, Dana. And I'd like to open up the floor if any other staff members would like to chime in as well.
I think that was fantastic framing. I can just add in terms of the A. Donald McEachin Environmental Justice for All Act specifically, it contains a provision that would overturn Alexander versus Sandoval. And that requires plaintiffs to prove intentional discrimination despite evidence of discriminatory impact. So that would codify the prohibition of discrimination based on disparate impacts. So, the EJ for All Act, like we've been saying, is a very comprehensive piece of legislation and would actually make changes to the Civil Rights Act to enable impacted people with better tools to fight back and have legal protection for disparate impacts. So, a great question and definitely very top of mind. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you, Astrid. Another question that we had was, with appropriations at top of mind, what should we keep in mind to protect environmental justice? And actually, Astrid, can I pass it back to you to answer this question?
Sure, that works. Thanks, AJ. I think, one thing we just want to be very clear about is it's very imperative that we firmly reject all harmful partisan policy riders and pass clean appropriations bills. It's been very concerning, the really horrific amendments, to be frank, that we've been seeing in the House passed appropriations bills. And they really are chock full of racist and polluter-friendly amendments. So I think that's a very important call, is just making sure that in the appropriations process, there are no harmful riders as a rule. And I think the other piece that we always try to underscore is, thinking back to the debt ceiling fight, it's really critical that environmental justice communities do not continue to be sacrificed or kind of used as a bargaining chip to pass, these critical legislation and run the government. So we were really disappointed in the debt ceiling fight when, there were rollbacks to NEPA and EJ communities kind of were on the negotiating block. So we just really want to, underscore how critical it is that our communities and, the EJ communities in your districts are not sacrificed to be able to get, the MAGA Republicans on board and keep the government funded.
Thank you, Astrid. And then one other question that we had was, how can our offices best engage and align with your team's priorities? And I can take this one. I would say, please feel free to view our team members as policy experts. Our doors are always open to provide additional education, connect you all with frontline allies, especially those that are active in your constituencies. And also, we are always happy to collaborate on advocacy to the administration, to agencies, aligning on any public releases, statements, or comments such as those. In the past, as our executive director Peggy said, and as well as our director Dana mentioned, we were incredibly grateful to have gotten very strong wins for environmental justice in partnership with congressional offices. And while I do want to note that we as an organization can speak for the EJ movement as a whole, we will always be available to ensure that y'all's priorities and activities are grounded in the principles of environmental justice. And if you all would like to connect with a specific staff member directly, please contact me or Astrid, and we'll be happy to direct you to the appropriate policy expert.
And to that end, I saw the question of the best person to connect for district offices in New York. Feel free to just get in touch with AJ and I, and we can make sure to, get you connected with the best contacts. So we can be like the first stop at WEACT, and we're very happy to make the most relevant connections.
I'll give it a few minutes if anyone else wants to submit any questions using the Q&A box. And great, we have one more question. With elections coming up, what legislation are WEACT prioritizing in order to protect democracy? And Astrid, would you like to take this one?
Sure. Thank you. So, protecting democracy and expanding voting rights is definitely a very big priority that you'll see represented in our policy agenda, even though we didn't get a chance to discuss it today. We often talk about how it's impossible for us to be advancing these priorities as, voters are disenfranchised and, their voices aren't being heard in our elections. So just off the top of my head, some legislation that we've been advancing and really encourage your offices to be supporting, I'm sure most of you probably already are the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, the Freedom to Vote Act, and then also legislation like the Disclose Act that focuses on, reforming election financing and improving transparency. So those are a couple, but as always, we look forward to hearing more from your offices and are happy to discuss further. And I'll drop our emails in the chat too.
Great. And we have another question. What are the organization's top line aspirations when it comes to permitting reform and improved enforcement actions at the state and federal level against permit violations? Maybe Jasmine, would you be open to answering that question?
Sure thing. Thanks, AJ. And Dana, I imagine you may want to jump in as well. So do you want to take it away?
No, I was thinking you.
Okay. All righty. Well, I'll be brief. I think my colleagues have outlined really well how involved we are with NEPA as an avenue for permitting reform, but we do know that there are many other proposals that are attempting to weigh in on how a project is cited, cost allocation processes, and other DC. Other ways in which communities can and need to be engaged in the permitting process. And so I'll just quickly name maybe 3 top line values that we have advocated for in the past year, which would be, of course, community participation that is tailored and specific to the community. And so we understand that there are many different ways that when a project is proposed, folks want to be notified and alerted, but the best way to find out how to do that is to ask the community first. Every community is different, as AJ noted. We have been privileged to see the diversity of environmental justice communities and therefore the diverse needs. So the first one, I would say community engagement that's tailored to the community. The second one would be an process by which folks can learn about a project. There is sometimes an assumption that environmental justice communities, climate justice communities don't have the capacity to really delve into the details of a project, but that is not true. And WEACT has seen time and time again where communities actually want to know the nitty-gritty in the weeds, as we often say in this work. And the third one would be identifying ways to support communities that house projects, particularly on the clean side, for the life cycle of the project. So not just the beginning, which is of course incredibly important and vital, but throughout the permitting process and into the project's life term. Many of these projects on the clean side have 20 or 30 years, and that's a minimum. So we want to make sure that communities feel supported throughout the life cycle. And I'm happy to share more resources that we've done in this space as well.
And I think, Christopher, what I would add to what Jasmine shared is that, one of our values is to be grounded in a place of honesty. And it's important for us to tell the truth about the real barriers to permitting projects. And if we look at this historically, there have been 3 main barriers. One has been project developers have not had the resources to be able to move these large scale projects forward. And that, I think, if we are talking within the context of our energy economy, we've addressed that with the work that your offices have done through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. So check on problem solved. The second is, as Jasmine mentioned, not following the process. And as she noted, early, often continual engagement will address some of those relational challenges that exist in moving projects forward. So check mark for that. And then the final thing is related to having the bandwidth to be able to properly follow the permitting process. And one of the things that I feel really proud that our team was one of the first to put on the table was that there needs to be more money for agencies and departments to engage in this process. Staffing, again, systems, resources that help move things forward. And again, your offices took care of that when your bosses voted to have $1 billion for NEPA for permitting implementation take place as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act. So we've solved the 3 biggest challenges. The next thing for us to do together is to ensure that these agencies and departments have this money to be able to do these 3 things. And I think that if we give ourselves time, we will see improvements to the permitting process. So I want us to be really critical when we talk about reform, because we may be trying to solve a problem that we have already collectively addressed.
Thank you so much for the answers, Jasmine and Dana. And I see that we are at time, so I'll wrap up our Q&A session now. If you all have any other further questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to me or Astrid, and we will be sure to connect you to the appropriate expert on our team. I just want to thank all the members of our staff for joining us today. And on behalf of everyone at WEACT in both DC and Harlem, we'd like to thank you all for attending, and we look forward to continue working with you all in the coming months. Please make sure to follow us on X, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook at WEACT4EJ, and please be on the lookout for a recording of this webinar to be made available on our YouTube. Thank you all so much.